mighty American battleships completely dominated. They projected massive, terrifying industrial power across the globe. These steel leviathans demanded millions of tons of hardened armor. The government desperately asked the civilian population for a profound personal sacrifice. In 1942, millions of American housewives threw their frying pans and their children's toys into furnaces to build battleships. But there is a bizarre logistical truth the government hid from them for decades. That household iron never made it to the sea. The geopolitical economic trap snapped shut. If the ships weren't made from frying pans, what were they collecting scrap iron for? Let us examine this bizarre financial and psychological nightmare. This isn't a story about military logistics. This is the greatest psychological economic scam in history. When total war requires absolute civilian compliance, a government will aggressively manufacture a crisis to secure unquestioning loyalty. Let us unearth the bizarre ledgers of the American scrap drive. The scale of this operation was mind-boggling. The federal government demanded absolute sacrifice. Millions of Americans answered the sudden call to arms. Propaganda posters plastered the walls of every suburban neighborhood. The state required endless supplies of raw industrial material. Federal officials promised that every contribution built the war. Ordinary housewives felt an overwhelming, deeply personal duty to defend their faraway sons. By transforming domestic chores into military acts, the state successfully weaponized the mundane American household. Mountains of scrap iron rapidly accumulated, when children dragged heavy red wagons filled with rusted radiators. Boy Scouts scoured abandoned lots for discarded automobile parts. Mayors organized massive communal dumping grounds in city squares. The sheer volume of collected metal was visually staggering. Families proudly surrendered their cherished cast iron skillets and heavy, ornate Victorian park fences. This highly visible, communal forfeiture created an inescapable atmosphere of shared national economic burden. The National Extraction Campaign was relentless. Municipal governments competed fiercely to gather the most metal. Schools canceled classes to send children into the streets. Historic cannons from local parks were unceremoniously melted down. Even ancient cemetery gates were ripped from the frozen ground, when entire communities gleefully dismantled their own civic heritage under the intoxicating spell of wartime patriotism. The systemic liquidation of domestic infrastructure reveals the terrifying efficiency of state-sponsored psychological mobilization programs. But how do you force millions of people to destroy their own property without using a single soldier? The propaganda machine orchestrated total participation. Newsreels showcased towering monuments of donated pots and
Americans are
pans.
stepping up to the plate, donating
Hollywood
their old
celebrities
aluminum pots
urged the
and
working
pans for the
class
war
to give
effort.
everything.
Every pound of scrap metal
The
brings
War
victory
Production
closer.
Board established strict civilian collection quotas. Neighborhood committees aggressively shamed anyone refusing to donate metal. Citizens who withheld their private property faced severe psychological isolation and brutal public ostracization. Leveraging peer pressure as an economic enforcement tool guarantees maximum compliance without deploying the military. The media engineered a permanent frenzy. Radio broadcasters constantly read out the rising scrap tonnages. Comic books featured superheroes fighting the enemy with scrap. The entire cultural apparatus focused exclusively on domestic collection. Every waking moment was saturated with the federal collection mandate. Housewives obsessed over their metal quotas, completely distracting them from the horrific, rising battlefield casualties. By monopolizing the public's attention with busy work, a government effectively sanitizes the brutal, bloody reality of combat. Every donation purchased psychological war equity. Giving away a frying pan felt like firing live bullets. The domestic populace desperately needed a tangible, a physical connection. The overseas conflict felt terrifyingly distant and hopelessly uncontrollable. Scrap drives provided a desperately craved illusion of physical control.
The enemy will stop at nothing
Donating
to
a child's
undermine our
broken
resolve.
tricycle offered a grieving,
war bonds.
terrified mother a profound sense of agency. When a populace directly invests their physical property, their emotional commitment to the state becomes absolute. Behind the scenes, however, the logistics were quietly collapsing. The rail yards choked on domestic garbage. Thousands of trains hauled this civilian metal toward foundries. The logistical network struggled under the immense, useless weight. Rusted bed frames and bent bumpers flooded the national steel mills. The industrial infrastructure was completely overwhelmed by the massive influx. Railway workers broke their backs transporting millions of tons of completely unsorted, heavily degraded junk. Transporting vast quantities of unrefined civilian waste violently disrupts the highly calibrated logistical arteries of war. The hidden financial cost was staggering. The government spent millions organizing the civilian collection routes. Precious gas and rubber were wasted transporting the useless trash. The internal bureaucracy required to manage the drives was massive. It was a massive economic black hole disguised as charity. The state knowingly burned through precious, highly rationed domestic fuel just to move worthless, rusted metal. Tolerating massive logistical inefficiencies is a calculated expense when the true goal is securing domestic political stability. The foundries received an absolute mess. Their factory managers stared blankly at mountains of ruined cookware. Industrial processing requires highly specific, pure grades of raw ore. The donated scrap was heavily contaminated with unwanted, cheap alloys.
Read all about the
Separating the
Victory
usable
Scrap
iron
Drive.
from the trash was physically impossible. Exhausted factory laborers spent thousands of hours fruitlessly attempting to sort through the rusted civilian debris. Introducing unregulated, contaminated materials into a precision industrial environment effectively sabotages the entire modern manufacturing process. The furnaces stalled. The government celebrated a glorious victory. Newspapers declared the scrap drives an unprecedented logistical triumph. The public believed their pots were becoming thick, armored hulls. The collective national morale soared to incredibly high, enthusiastic levels. And funding for the global war effort received massive, unquestioning support. Millions of ordinary citizens slept peacefully, firmly believing their personal sacrifices directly protected the distant Navy. A successfully executed propaganda campaign fundamentally overrides the physical reality of the actual economic supply chain. But inside the factories, the truth was impossible to hide. The metallurgical engineers finally saw reality. The factories actually had enough high-grade iron ore stockpiled. The citizens were elated by the magnificent, massive communal achievement. But the industrial scientists stared at the useless civilian scrap. The metallurgical experts began holding their tired heads in despair. The brilliant minds tasked with building the impenetrable war machine realized the dark, entirely absurd truth. The factories had enough iron, the citizens were elated, but the metallurgical engineers started holding their heads in despair. Why? The metallurgical truth was brutally harsh. Naval battleships require perfectly forged, high-carbon industrial steel plates. They must withstand the devastating impact of enemy torpedoes. Frying pans are forged from cheap, brittle cast iron. Melted kitchenware immediately shatters under the massive ballistic pressure of actual naval combat. Constructing military armor from civilian scrap metal guarantees the rapid, catastrophic destruction of the resulting vessel. The logistical failure was completely absurd. Government foundries quietly rejected the massive, contaminated civilian scrap donations. The impure metal completely ruined their highly calibrated furnaces, and millions of tons of donated iron were entirely useless. The proud, patriotic sacrifices of American housewives were silently dumped into massive, forgotten junkyards. When a state prioritizes propaganda over metallurgy, the resulting physical supply chain becomes a ridiculous wasteland. So what happened to all those mountains of metal? The towering scrap mountains just rusted. Unusable civilian metal formed gigantic, decaying hills across America. The highly publicized collections never saw a single shipyard. Some scrap was melted into massive, completely impure blocks. These worthless iron cubes sat rotting in empty lots while the bloody war raged overseas. The physical evidence of the greatest wartime mobilization program was literally left to decay in secret. The military used brand new industrial steel. Authentic naval production relied entirely on pristine, freshly mined ore. Professional contractors bypassed the heavily contaminated civilian scrap piles completely. The glorious fleet was forged by traditional, highly regulated supply lines. While citizens believed their toys protected the troops, the factories quietly ignored their passionate donations. A sovereign nation waging global war will never trust its actual survival to contaminated domestic garbage. The grand deception was flawlessly executed. Bureaucrats intentionally created the fake demand for low-grade scrap. They knew the metal was technically useless from the beginning. Local mayors continued staging elaborate, highly emotional scrap collection drives. The heartbreaking reality was that millions of cherished family heirlooms were destroyed for absolutely nothing. Maintaining the illusion of urgent necessity required the state to continuously harvest and discard civilian property. The actual economics revealed absolute absurdity. Transporting the junk cost more than mining raw, fresh iron. The government absorbed this massive financial loss with complete silence. Authentic military contractors simply laughed at the contaminated domestic material. The sheer scale of this invisible, orchestrated waste highlights the dark comedy of domestic wartime mobilization. When a government subsidizes deliberate inefficiency, the hidden objective is never logistical, but entirely psychological control. This brings us to the most terrifying question of all. The government demanded psychological total compliance. If they knew the scrap metal was useless, why collect? They didn't need this massive collection drive for the metal. The state desperately needed it for widespread mass domestic psychology. Once a devoted housewife personally donated her frying pan, she would never protest. By forcibly extracting a meaningless physical sacrifice, the regime successfully purchased absolute, unquestioning national loyalty. This was brilliant, dark behavioral economics. The collection drives effectively eliminated domestic resistance to war taxes. Citizens quietly accepted severe food shortages and heavily rationed goods. They believed their personal deprivations directly built the armored fleet. This psychological manipulation actively secured the home front from rebellion. The true currency of the American war machine was never iron, but blind faith. When a populace surrenders their private property, their emotional investment silences all rational dissent against conflict. This is the price of chaos. We must connect this historical manipulation to our present day. Modern authorities still utilize these exact same psychological economic levers. They demand visible public sacrifices to enforce unified political compliance. When a government asks you to sacrifice something small for the absolute greater good, sometimes what the sovereign state desperately needs isn't your physical property, but your unquestioning, total compliance. Governments always manipulate the economic truth. The useless scrap drives stand as a profound historical warning. Complex state logistics frequently disguise deeply cynical methods of control. We are naturally conditioned to trust the official patriotic narrative. But authentic historical investigations constantly reveal the terrifying depths of institutional deception and propaganda. The ultimate objective of total war is always the complete psychological subjugation of the domestic population.
Cannot obscure the
The ledgers of history remain open. The rusting civilian mountains of useless metal eventually faded away. But the devastating psychological tactics of wartime logistics permanently survived. We continuously uncover the hidden, bizarre financial machinery. Join us in exploring the terrifying human cost behind history's most devastating global conflicts. Please subscribe, drop a like, and comment your thoughts on this massive historical deception below.